Larry, could you close those doors? Thanks. We'll turn over to Joshua 23. We're in our next to last week in our study. And the gist of chapter 23 of Joshua, as some of you will probably note in a heading that you might have, is that this is his farewell address. Now, I think most of us like to think that as we get to the end of our lives that we would be sane enough of mind to be able to put together something where we would be able to share what it is that is on our heart and what we want for the people we're leaving behind. Have you ever thought about that, about what that would be like, what you would say? I think, for me, I'll find myself going into the negative. I'm really sorry I didn't do da-da-da-da-da-da. I should have done this more, should have done that less. And I think a lot of us share this. And I suspect Joshua could have done the same thing, but, he had bigger fish to fry in that he is not going to see these people that he's led for at least a generation, and when you count his being with Moses, 2 generations. He's 110 years old, which in those days wasn't really over the hill or anything like that. But I'm sure his brain was pretty tired. I would expect it would be. Anyone wanted to share? It's kind of an uncomfortable thing about something you want to say to the people that you have had the most influence over. Now he's saying, in a very big way, what he wants for Israel, the people, and he became the leader of Israel when Moses ended his reign or rule, if you will, and so he spent a lot of time. He spent what I think was probably a pretty difficult time. But certainly he was the one who was most responsible for, the battle, and I put an S on the end of battles, that were fought to gain the land that God had promised them. So any ideas about things that you might want to say to someone? Okay, don't anyone just share your heart or anything like that. Okay, go ahead. You know your name, Kevin. And then Danny, you're second.
Well, it's one of those things that you always have kind of this mindset of, okay, well, even though I'm gone, things are going to keep going, so
Yeah.
keep doing what you're supposed to do, which I kind of stole from the fact of some of the stuff in which Paul himself and Moses end up saying in their farewell addresses, because it happens a couple of times.
Yeah, there's a few. Peter gives what really amounts to a closing, at least book, really. But go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, well, and one of the big, messages that comes through from these leaders is that, you know what, my time is up, but your time is still going, and so do what you got to do.
Yeah, he spends a lot of time, Joshua, really talking about the future. He doesn't talk really about the past. And again, I find that a little bit, at least for me, something that I think shows a great deal amount of caring that he has for what's going to happen when he goes. And so he talks about that. And so the thing that he mentions, I guess, is the thing that we probably would expect him to say. I'm going to be going, and we're going to have to keep this thing going good, because it had been going fairly well, since they had moved into where they moved into. And We've got to keep it up. We've got to keep it up. So, I mean, that's pretty much what you read here. Go ahead, Dana.
Well, to Christian, that's what you would say. Keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
But, to people, to those of us who have non-Christian family, you probably want to say, get faithful and stay faithful.
Sure, right. Yeah, and he points out in his dissertation, he says, I know there's going to be a lot of things that can get in the way of doing the right thing. And isn't that, the way life is generally? He talks about, stay on the path. You can go to the left. You can go to the right. Meaning that there are options. And so what might have been some of the things he might have been concerned about with them in that regard? The ways they could get off track. It's in the text, but idolatry would be the main thing. You came into this land. We didn't completely rid ourselves of idolatry, but enough to be pleasing to the Father, at least for the circumstances that were there. And they're going to be there. They're going to influence you because you're not going to get rid of them all. And we've already sort of established that they didn't do that. And so if they're around the people, then the people are going to be influencing them. That's just the way it works. If you have any kind of relationship, it has a great effect on you, particularly if you're with them a lot. And so one of the things that's principal in this part of the discussion is that he tells them don't intermarry with the people. And that becomes a real problem at the tail end of things in Nehemiah and in Ezra, where that's pointed out as a real major faux pas on their part, that's what we did. And so if we in fact get ourselves in contact with and being influenced by people who are not sympathetic to what we believe, then that can be problematic. Now, there are always going to be exceptions to that. But the point is, I think it's important enough to be considered because Joshua goes out of his way to say, don't allow yourself to be influenced. All right, so let's go ahead and begin there in chapter 23 and verse 1. It says, it came about after many days when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies on every side, and Joshua was old and advanced in years. Then Joshua called for all Israel and for the elders and their heads and their judges and their officers and said to them, I am old, advanced in years, and you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to you, to all these nations, because of you, or on behalf of you. For the Lord your God is he who has been fighting for you. What I like to think is Joshua would have been respected and they would have listened to what he said. But, a lot of times what happens when someone gets older, somebody stopped listening to the older folks at some point down here. And there could be other ways, that they moved off the path. But we do know that one of the things was to intermarry with the Canaanites and those who worship Baal. But have you ever thought about that? I mean, when I look at some of these speeches like this, I just assume that people are going to listen to them. They're going to see them as authoritative, just like with Moses. Moses made a very similar speech. So how do you think people would have reacted to him? Try to put yourself in the place of being there. We all know how he should react, or they should react, at least I think. But how do you think people did react to what he said and what he's going to say? The principle is clear. There's nothing fancy here. You don't have to be able to sort of dig deep and figure out all the dark places. Okay, Dan.
Okay, so the first thing I'm going to say is, no, you're not going to die. Don't be
Oh, okay.
dying. You're not going to die.
Sure.
So they don't take them seriously.
That could be a problem. Yeah. But he does carry it all through. He dies fairly soon after that. But that's the way people generally are. Oh, don't talk about that. I mean, he's able to stand up in front of all these people and still speak. I mean, it must mean that he's got a little left in the tank. So go ahead. I'll get you next, Kevin, but go ahead, Vance. Yeah. 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 Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, well, with the result as far as how they listened, Judges 2, they didn't.
Yeah, well, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt that it took maybe a little while to get to that point. But yes, we know where they ended up. Since we're on the holiday trip of Thanksgiving, and of course, I'm a great believer in that, we don't really need a day to be people who are giving thanks. Just a second. I can see you thinking, Micah. I know you, Micah. Starts scratching his beard a little bit. And then, I know you're ready to say something, so I want you to think about it. Okay? But I think what he's saying to them, remember God did this. And so he's taken the credit away from him. And then I think he wants them to be thankful for what God has done. He got us here. And so what's the way you're going to be expressing your thankfulness to God in this situation? Go ahead, Micah. Yeah. Nobody else is saying anything just yet, but go ahead.
I might be getting ahead because I know we're going to be probably may cover it going into Judges, but
yeah, don't get too far ahead.
Just I wonder how serious the people took what he said.
Yeah.
Based on the results, because if it was in the law that they were to instruct their children.
Yeah.
About this, there's kind of just this gap where you don't know. It's not clearly stated. Hey, did they tell their children, or
Yeah.
did the children hear it and they rejected it?
Yeah.
We don't know that.
Right.
Well, we know the results, but we don't know how the people took seriously what the commandments and what Joshua said.
Yeah, and there are times when it says they took it really seriously when some of these other speeches have been made along the way. But there's nothing really new about what he's saying here. I mean, this seems to be a very obvious thing. God got us through here. The way we're going to be pleasing to God is what? Doing what God says. So we know it, we have to learn it, we have to understand what it is, but the important thing is what? We must act. So it's not a matter of having all the theory down. A lot of people can get the theory, but have a very difficult time practicing it. But I could see people just saying, oh, well, of course, this is what we do. This is what Joshua's been saying all the way. We ought to obey God because that's what he's supposed to say. I mean, and I think they could get kind of blasé about this because we do in general. It's kind of our nature sometimes. Oh, I've heard that sermon so many times. And so I could see where there might have been a response somewhat like that. But I mean, that's not the way Joshua intends it to be. Yes, Kelsey, did you? Oh, yeah. You need to do this. There you go. You gotta work on those exercises at home, Janine, like that. Go ahead, Janine.
We have to apply this to
Yeah.
ourselves so much.
Yeah.
And so much I have been thinking about our couples and married couples and teaching your children
Mm-hmm.
and what the results were back there.
Sure.
Talk to each other when you are young.
Right.
When you're first married. What happens? What is going to happen when I die? Think
Sure.
about it ahead of time and
Yeah, and I think you make a good point there, Janine, because, the speech probably doesn't really matter as much as, what happens before the speech. But, in the case of Joshua, this guy's been really working hard to do his best to bring the people along in the way that God would want them to be. So, I don't know. It's all conjecture, really, for us to try to think about, well, how did they react? I think we kind of know how they, probably some took it very seriously, and then some were probably, on the back row, So, anybody else now on this? Yes, go ahead, Carrie. So, your partner. Go ahead, Cindy. Sorry.
It actually lasts quite a while. It says at the end of Joshua that Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua and had known all the deeds of the Lord. So they lasted pretty long.
Through at least a generation. Yeah, I mean, Joshua, they've been listening to him all along, but that whole generation apparently was doing what they were supposed to be doing. But even then, we would call it a success. But the word got taught, and so makes a success. Go ahead, Cindy. You going to say something else?
Just that this is quite a transition where now they're stationary and there's not really a leader per se.
Yeah.
So it's also a big transition that way with all those people.
Yeah, I mean, before it was like, it's kind of like building the building. We're building the building, and everybody's into it and excited about it. And then all of a sudden, we're finished building the building. And now what do we do? Because, I've heard this so many times, oh man, the days when we were building the building, things were really hot. And, but then you get beyond it. They'd done all of that to take the land. And that must have been, the people lost their lives, and there was certainly a lot of destruction that they all experienced. But it's over now. And so there was, we can't say for sure, but we assume that it's months anyway, that, the generation eventually died out. I'm assuming they're about the age of Joshua. But he's saying to them what he would like to see for the future. He's not going over the past. He says, "See, I have apportioned to you these nations," this is verse 4 of chapter 23, "which remains as an inheritance for your tribes with all the nations which I have eliminated from the Jordan, even to the great sea toward the west. And the Lord your God, he will thrust them away from you and drive them from you, and you will take possession of their land, just as the Lord your God promised." In other words, what was the promise? I'm going to take you in there, and we are going to defeat those who are idolaters and those who are going to be a very, very negative influence on you. And that's what he wanted to accomplish. So I've done my part. Does that sound reasonable? That's what he's saying, that we've done our part. We've tried to teach you, that we've got some fairly good leaders, I think he's saying. But here's where he sort of changes the tone a little bit. He says, "And you will take possession of their land, just as the Lord your God promised you." And then what are the first three words of verse 6? Starts with a B. Be very firm, someone says? Okay, and mine says determined, the New American Standards. Anybody have anything else other than that?
Therefore be very courageous.
Courageous, okay, something over here? Very strong, okay. All right, so you have received, the plan has been completed, just like it was promised to you. Now you have it. Now it's up to you to do something. And I think as far as going backward, what would be good for them to remember? As far as the past is concerned. Just kind of be practical about that. What would they remember that might be encouraging or something like that?
How much the Lord was with them.
Yeah. Remember all those times, and remember when it looked like, things were going to really go down the tubes, and God comes along and we get water, and God comes along and he provides us with food, that sort of thing. We do need to remember that, but this is where we kind of get to Janine's point, and that is, at some point, they didn't know. That generation didn't know. And there's only one way that I know that they can get to know, and that is they must be taught, right, Janine? That's her point. So, and I think we all understand that. And of course, that's easier said than done. And I think when I think of, at the end of my life, and I'm thinking about, my family and all those things and the people I've had around me, I want to think I really did my best, but a lot of times it's really hard to, to see that, because there are things that just don't work out the way I would like for them to, or for the way you would. I think all of us, to one extent or another, can say that about our families. And it's heartbreaking. And I don't know that, it would matter a whole lot here if they thought about the negative. It's probably going to be a little bit more detrimental to them than if they say, okay, let's remember what God has done. Now, they were notorious for forgetting that. But, just remember what God has done, and remind yourself that this is your way of saying thank you to God by doing His will. Anybody else? All right, go ahead now. And so he says, be very determined then to keep and do everything that is written in the book of the law of Moses, so that you will not turn aside from it to the right or to the left. So what's going to guide them along the way? The law of Moses. Some say it's all the five, the Pentateuch. Some say it's just Deuteronomy. It doesn't really matter. I think traditionally it was those 5 books. But if you're going to know what to do, then we have to teach what God would want them to know. Make sense? So you study what was the law then. This was what guided them, the law of Moses. We teach them that. That's our job. And then the desire that we all have is that somehow on the other end we're going to try to do the best we can to get them to practice those things. But that's what God wants. See, and that's why, I don't know, we get so caught up in the rearing of children and being married and that sort of thing. Sometimes it's hard to remain focused, because it seems like there are a lot of things that take us to the left or to the right. It may not be idolatry, but there are plenty of other things, right? That kind of get in our way. And next thing you know, you say, boy, what happened to those 5 years or those 10 years? And so the thrust of it all is that you need to learn the law, and you will not turn aside from it to the right or to the left, so that you will not associate with these nations, these which remain with you, or mention the name of their God. So he acknowledges that they're there. And we talked about some situations where they were allowed in certain little pockets, or make anyone swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them, but you are to cling to the Lord your God. So the temptation is going to be, and we can think about the influences that we have in our culture. There are things out there that we don't really want to have anything to do. We don't want our children to know about certain things. But I guess it's not enough to say, okay, I don't want you to do those things. What we should probably be thinking more about is giving them something to know. And that's easier said than done too. And I think we do try pretty hard as a congregation, certainly in the way we try to teach our children, to try to impress upon them the things that are right. Are there failures along the way? Are some of it's not the parents we should be? Sure, that's going to be the case. But he's saying there are distractions out here. And the distractions are what we read about in verse 7. And what was the focus there? We've already kind of hit upon it, but what was it that was going to be the big problem? The idolatry. You're going to be there. There's still some people who are there who are idolatrous, and you're going to be affected by them. And so there's only one thing that's going to keep you on the path. Now, maybe you'll have people around you who are going to encourage you, but that's not the way Joshua puts it. He knows it's what we know, and it's what we learn, and then what we teach that we must pass on. And I think that's one of those things that certainly I think about. Boy, I wish I could have emphasize certain things a little bit more in my family. I wish I could have taken a little bit more time. But, all those regrets don't really help a whole lot, at least at this point for these people. The problem they have is that we know who the problem is going to be. These people out here who are distracting us with their worldliness and their idolatry. And so we've got to stay on the path. Go ahead, Mary.
If we really stick with what God teaches us in the Bible,
Yeah.
we think, okay, we are the mother, this is command for the mothers,
Yeah.
to teach their children day and night
Yeah.
on the doorsteps and no matter where they're at,
Yeah. Every opportunity. Yeah.
all the time, all day.
Yeah.
And if you do this, then your child is going to know what the Bible teaches.
Yeah.
And you don't have to depend on learning it from the class there.
Yeah, or from the society. I wish the society were better, so then it'd be easier for us to follow God. Well, I don't think society as a rule is really that concerned about that. Certainly, there are people out there who are, but there are a lot of people who really don't want people to be learning about the words of God. And so they teach, they spend the time, we spend the time, and that's important. And at least we will have done what we can. There's a book we have, just a second, Mary. There's a book that's been a women's study book for years. She hath done what she could. And that's what we want to be able to say, that we've done what we can. But at the same time, I think most of us kind of look back and say, I wish I'd have done better. Okay, one quick point, Mary, go ahead.
Even with my own children,
Right.
I've noticed, and especially I've noticed it with my grandchildren,
Sure.
parents spend more time with their children academics at school,
Uh-huh.
basketball.
Oh, athletics, yeah, okay. Yeah, right.
They don't take any time to spend
Yeah.
teaching them the Bible.
Right. Yeah. Well, we want the kids to get exercise, and that's a good thing. But again, it only profits so much, is what Paul says. And I don't know. There's just certain things we do with the idea that we're going to make them a more complete, well-rounded child. And so there's this great emphasis in our culture on, by the time you're 2 years old, you should be on a soccer team somewhere. And so that's the emphasis. And so it's really hard because we think generally it's a good thing. I mean, and it is, but what happens, and some of us have discussed this, this happens on this day and that happens on that day, and next thing you know, it's kind of swallowed all our lives up. So we've got to try to find a way to sort of move forward in a positive way. Okay, so he says, cling to the Lord your God, that's verse 8, as you have done to this day. So there is certainly a congratulations there, going back to Cindy's comment, that they'd had some success and they were faithful. For the Lord has driven out great and mighty nations from before you, and as for you, no one has stood against you to this day. Meaning what? Remember why we're here. Because God has stood with us the whole time. And if we don't trust Him, and we don't do what He wants us to do, then it's not a matter of being bored with teaching. It's saying, I'm not really appreciative of what God is, who God is, and what God teaches. And that's why I'm trying to emphasize that right here, is to realize that there is that sense of, why do I do what I do? And I think, we will say sometimes not, I think Justin said something about this, about what, why we obey, and it shouldn't be because, it's wrong to disobey so much as it is we show God we love Him. So we look at it more from that angle. And I think it's a very reasonable thing to do. But what I'm trying to emphasize too is part of that love that Justin was talking about is, okay, God deserves my thanks. And so how am I going to do it? How am I going to show that? You ever had somebody do something really nice for you, and then you go, what can I do to repay them for what they've done? God makes it easy. Not so much that it's not challenging, but it's, okay, here it is. I don't need any gifts. I don't need anything else. I just need for you to say, I give thanks to you for what you've done for me, and I'm going to try to live forward as much as I can successfully for you. Okay, so now we keep on reading. So take great care for yourselves that you love the Lord your God. And so, certainly in this context, what does that mean? He said, read the law, because that's the only place you're going to find out. You're not going to find out from, the local Baal worship hut. You're not going to find out there. So he says, for if you ever go back and cling to the rest of these nations, and this is where this comes out often. It's like, let's think about this. Look at all the work, look at all the blood and guts that went into getting this land. And now we're just going to go along with what they still want to do? There's a certain lack of logic to the whole thing. We need to know that we didn't take this land in order to live like they live, because that was what God said allowed them to take these people whose sin has reached the fullness. And so that's what God does with those who refuse to be obedient to him. But he's saying, we did a lot to get where we are right now. But we got to move forward. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, well, and then, as we kind of talked about this too, I just in my mind was sitting with Gideon, where it gets down to the 300 people.
Yeah.
And going in for the very purpose of saying that way you can see that this isn't anything you're doing, but this is God's power. There's a lot of things that have happened up till this point, and
Yeah.
people are very involved in the actions that are taking place. But
Yeah.
key things here is that it wasn't just you, it wasn't just me, and that's kind of what you've been getting at here. And one of my favorite ways of kind of changing this mindset is, it's not that we're obligated to God, I like to say we're obliged rather than obligated, because obliged gives this idea of grateful.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful that I'm indebted through my gratitude.
Sure.
Rather than like, oh, I have no choice, I must do this thing because I'm obligated.
Right, yeah. That's a good, we do have to try to put that in some perspective that makes it something other than just, oh, not this again. What is it that God has given me? And it's so easy to take it for granted. Now, what we have here, we haven't quite gotten down to it yet. It says, take care forever if you go back. No. Okay, verse 13. Know with certainty that the Lord your God will not continue to drive these nations out from before you. In other words, if you decide you're going to be like them, I'm not going to do anything about getting them out of here. It's on you now. And of course, what was the promise that he made? Okay, I will remove you from the land. Now, there are going to be, when you get into the book of Judges, that's where there are at least certain spurts of time when the effort was being made to try to get back to it. But notice now what he goes on to say. He says, they will be a snare and a trap to you, and a whip on your sides and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land which the Lord your God has given to you. They're not going to be a positive influence. I think most of us kind of have mixed feelings, about this, because we're thinking, okay, if we're going to be around these people, we have to, influence them in a positive way, and we must be, we've got to be nice. We've got to make the effort, to get along with them, so they'll know that we don't think bad things about them. But the point is, we don't have to give it that kind of definition. We just have to say, here's what God says. Here's what God says. Here's what God says. And of course, the ideal is, for us to get ourselves in that sort of a position to be able to do that. And that doesn't often happen, where we can have that sort of conversation. But he says, if you don't do what you're supposed to do, what I've always wanted you to do, and what got us to this point, then it's really all been wasted, in a sense. Not completely, but wasted. He says, it will come about that just as all the good words which the Lord God spoke to you have come upon you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the warnings until he has eliminated you from this good land which the Lord your God has given you. When you violate the covenant, I'm reading verse 16. When you violate the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and you go and serve other gods and bow down to them, then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and you will perish quickly from the good land which he has given you. Now, some people might be there amongst the group. We know the leaders were there, and then we know a lot of people were there. And they're hearing this. Do you think some people would be going, oh boy, I don't know, it's kind of a downer now. I mean, we got here, we should be happy, we should be joyful. You know? Well, there's more to being a follower of God than being joyful and feeling good. And unfortunately, we shoot for that a lot because, that's what I think some of us believe it's supposed to be. I should be happy all the time. I should be totally at peace. Well, there is a peace that is to be had, but it doesn't mean that we're going to live our lives without static. And so we have to learn to also just to speak where God speaks. And let that be what it is, and live by it and stand by it. Yes, go ahead, Vance.
I wonder, all speculation at this point, but one of Joshua's, one of his worries may be that there was not a Joshua that was kind of coming behind him. I think that's the biggest difference between the end of Moses' life and the end of Joshua's life. At the end of Moses' life, Joshua moved pretty quickly.
Right.
The reign was a good transition. You have this leader, whereas if I'm Joshua, I'm at the end of his life. You're kind of saying all these warnings, almost anticipating there's not going to be someone there after me to be as strong of a voice.
Well, the organization is a little different. They're not a big swarm of people, traveling, walking along. They're divided up into their tribes. So maybe that's going to be the organization, because we've got the Levites, and we've talked about the cities of refuge and all. It's all kind of set up. But now keep finishing up what you're going to say.
You go throughout the history, and it's always like the people look to that person, whether it's Moses or Joshua. Then you get to the beginning of Judges, and
Yeah.
it says the people inquired of the Lord, who do we have lead us to conquer the next nation? And
Yeah.
people would respond. But you see this pattern of when there's not somebody who's kind of taking charge, whether it be a judge or Samuel or Joshua,
Sure.
people sort of spin into chaos. And again, I don't know how much of this influenced Joshua's
Yeah.
rhetoric here, but it's just interesting how it speaks to Israel's dependency on a person
Yeah.
to lead them. And we can sit here and point the finger at Israel. I don't know how much different we would be.
Yeah.
Relative to
Right.
other people.
Well, Judges is kind of, the answer to that. God puts up with them, and then they go, please save us, and then they raise someone up to do that. Maybe not of the stature of Moses or Joshua. Sometimes they're just military people who are able to defeat the offenders of all those things that are a distraction for them. So it is, I think, a lack of that. Leadership is one of those things where it's very significant, but it's also can be kind of a vague thing, somewhat ill-defined, and has a lot to do with, the people that are around the person who's being led. Do people want to follow that person? Is he or she being the kind of person that will cause people to want to follow them?
I think that's his message, right? It's like, don't be so focused on following me.
Yeah.
Follow God. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter who that person is. As long as
Yeah.
you follow the Lord, you'll be good to go.
Yeah, because this is different from the transition from Moses to Joshua, where, the guy who's been studying with Moses, so to speak, he is now going to be the guy. And now we don't have that in the offing. Yes, go ahead, Janine.
Yeah, is this the congregation that's mentioned in verse 9? It says there wasn't one word that Moses wrote that he did not read to all of them. He said the whole.
Yeah, okay, so they've heard it then. Okay, so now, as far as, who's all there or not, I mean, there were times, obviously, when there were masses of people.
Is that all of this 645, all of the Old Testament?
Yeah, sure.
Is it not one word?
Yeah. Well, he made sure that it was all out there. And so that is the essence of it. And so, as it says in chapter 24, verse 1, after saying, look, if we don't turn to God, then this is going to be the consequences. Then Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel at Shechem and called for the elders and their heads and their judges and their officers, and they presented themselves before God. Okay, so this is beginning to sound somewhat similar. Go ahead, Ian.
Just my kind of take on it. There seems to be a lot of emphasis on this idea of you must follow the Lord, and how you follow the Lord is by doing His commandments or doing the reports of the law.
That's, I think, in a simple way of looking at it, yes, I think that's true.
And it's like it's easy to focus on that, I guess is what I'm driving at. Because here's the shortfall from that. It's not just doing the works of the law. Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, everybody, they comment extensively about that.
Sure.
God comments through them, I should say. And so, what is it in fact that he's trying to get at? It's that you do these works of the law. Why? It's because when you look down and see the tassels on your cloak, you're going to remember the Lord. You're going to remember the promises that He made to you.
Right.
It's all in an effort to get you to be mindful of who Yahweh
Yeah.
is, what He has done for you, and that should evoke a want, a desire to be loyal and follow Him in that
Yeah.
sense. Like your love, as it says, watch yourselves carefully so as to love the Lord your God. You're not doing the commandments to love God, you're loving God.
Right.
And those commandments will
Well, I think the law creates this whole person. I don't think it's a matter of, okay, you go through and you make sure you check all the boxes. I think you're saying that. So,
And so, maybe to tie it in with all this, God was much more concerned with their hearts and their faith, which is why He selected this group in the first place. He got rid of the old generation, they died off in the
sure,
wilderness.
yeah.
He picked this new faithful group, young children in the faith, so to speak, and brought them into the promised land. Like it's this big, thematic type of thing that repeats itself over and over in the Bible, and it's the whole point of you must remember. If you're going to go in this land and be tempted to go to other things, don't let it do that. Remember.
Yeah, because that's the central issue here. I mean, it's not, even though he says read all, study all the law, what comes out of that is just this one discussion of faithfulness to God, and it revolves around idolatry. And so hopefully through one's understanding of the law, and we know that, it's not just commandments. There's a lot of things there from Genesis through Deuteronomy, which are principles that speak to the wholeness of a person. But you have to start somewhere. Okay? All right. Somebody else had a hand up? Thanks, Ian. Okay. There was one line over here that I skipped, and I really liked it, and I can't believe I skipped it, but it's over there in verse 12. No, that's not it. Okay, here it is. Let's go back to 9 and read 9 and 10. For the Lord has driven out great and mighty nations from before you, and as for you, no one has stood against you to this day. And then he uses this illustration. One of your men puts to flight 1,000. In other words, do you see what's been going on here? And it kind of goes back to the Gideon thing. And that is, have you noticed that we have defeated people when we've been overly shadowed with those who are fighting us? And he says, have you noticed that, and I think this is hyperbole, but he's saying that we've beaten the opposition with me behind it. God is poking them in some ways to help them to understand there's been a lot of things that you've been accomplishing, but it's because I've been there for you. So what maybe happens, to these people? Maybe they don't really think about the nearness of God. There may be some reason why they have this sense of who they are, and they've kind of lost it. Well, again, still, we cannot underestimate the understanding of what God wants and then what that produces. If it produces a bunch of just law keepers, then we've missed the point. But don't diminish that, because, you've got to start somewhere. God wants us to obey certain things because of who He is and what He has done for us. So that's where we'll stop. We'll just go over to Judges and read kind of how I gave you a couple of verses there in chapter 2 to understand, despite all this encouraging talk. Let's see. Mitch, would you read Judges 2, 6 through 11? Judges 2, 6 through 11. Please follow along. This will be it. We'll be finished.
When Joshua had dismissed the people, the sons of Israel, when each to his inheritance possessed the land, the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord which he had done for Israel. Then Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. And they buried him in the territory of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. All the generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them, who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel.
And then in verse 11 it says, Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. Now we can look at, what's the obvious thing. The obvious thing is that they didn't keep reminding them of God. And so, maybe it wasn't made interesting enough. I don't know. But the point is, I don't think that's the way God looks at it. It's my words. That's what matters. And so this is how it ends up. Even though there were still some good people, going back to Cindy's comment earlier, that had done a fairly good job. But now it's time for another generation to come along. And it's not looking all that great. And then that's one of the reasons why Judges is kind of an interesting book, but it's kind of discouraging in some ways when you see how easily they get themselves into a place where it seems like they've forgotten God. Okay, all right, thanks guys, appreciate it very much. I think the schedule says we'll do chapter 24 next week and maybe a couple other things, but that'll be our last class. Okay, thank you very much.